Grant Walker sat hunched over his desk, the blue light of the computer screen illuminating his face in the dimness of his home office. Scattered papers covered with diagrams and code snippets littered the surface around him. He rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in his chair, taking in the mess that had become his sanctuary over the past 6 months. This room, this cramped, cluttered space in their modest Denver suburban home, had witnessed the birth of what he believed would revolutionize the tech world. An app that combined cutting-edge AI with next-generation cybersecurity protocols. It wasn't just a product. It was his vision, his future. He checked the time. 7:15 p.m. Isla would be home soon. Tonight was the night. He'd rehearsed his pitch a dozen times, going over the numbers, the projections, the potential. Everything pointed to success if he could get the initial funding. The front door opened and closed. Grant's heart rate quickened. He took a deep breath, straightened the papers on his desk, and walked to the kitchen. Isla was unpacking groceries, her movements methodical and efficient, just like everything else she did. At 31, she carried herself with the precision of someone who managed million-dollar projects for a living. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she still wore her office attire, a gray blazer and matching slacks. "Hey," Grant said, leaning against the doorframe. "How was work?" Isla glanced up, offering a quick smile. "The usual. Johnson's team missed another deadline, so I spent most of the day doing damage control." She continued unloading groceries. "And Peterson keeps asking for budget extensions. I swear, that man wouldn't know fiscal responsibility if it hit him in the face." Grant nodded, only half listening. His mind was on his presentation, on the words he'd carefully selected to convince his wife that his dream was worth investing in. "I made some progress on the app today," he said, trying to sound casual. "The algorithm is finally working the way I envisioned." Isla's movement slowed, a subtle tell that Grant had learned to recognize over their 5 years of marriage. She was already putting up her guard. "That's good," she said, her tone neutral. Grant moved to help her with the groceries, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked in tandem. "I think it's ready, Isla. The app, I mean. It's time to take the next step." Isla closed the refrigerator door and turned to face him. Her brown eyes, usually warm, had turned cautious. "What next step?" Grant took a deep breath. "I need to quit my job, devote myself to this full-time, get a small team together, secure a proper workspace, launch this thing properly." Silence filled the kitchen. Isla crossed her arms. "And how much would that cost?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't please her. $65,000, Grant said, meeting her gaze. "From our savings." The change in Isla's demeanor was immediate. Her shoulders stiffened and her expression hardened. $65,000? You want almost all of our savings for this. Grant had anticipated resistance, but the immediate shutdown in her eyes caught him off guard. "It's not just some random idea, Isla. I've been working on this for months. The potential return is..." "Potential," Isla repeated, cutting him off. "That's the operative word, isn't it? Potential. Not guaranteed. Not certain. Nothing in life is certain," Grant countered, frustration beginning to bubble up. "But this is as close to a sure thing as it gets in tech. The market research supports it. The preliminary feedback from beta testers is overwhelmingly positive, and..." "It's too risky, Grant," Isla said flatly, shaking her head. "You're asking for everything. We have responsibilities. What if it fails?" The words hit Grant like a slap. "What if it succeeds? Have you considered that? This could set us up for life. Or it could bankrupt us," Isla replied, her voice rising slightly. "We have a house to pay for, retirement to save for. We can't gamble our future on an app that might go nowhere." Grant felt heat rising to his face. "This isn't a gamble. It's an investment. In me. In us. It's a fantasy," Isla said, her words cutting deep. "I'm not putting our life savings into a fantasy." "A fantasy?" Grant couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Is that what you think of my work? Of everything I pour my heart and soul into for the past 6 months?" Isla sighed, softening slightly at the hurt in his voice. "I didn't mean it like that. Your app is impressive, Grant. Your talent is undeniable. But launching a startup? That's a completely different ballgame. The statistics are against you. So that's it. You won't even consider it. Grant felt something inside him crumbling the foundation of support he'd always thought he could count on. We have a house, a future to secure. I'm not gambling with it, Isla stated firmly, turning away to continue unpacking groceries, signaling the end of the conversation. Grant stood frozen, watching his wife methodically arrange canned goods in the pantry as if they hadn't just discussed the future of his dreams. The dismissal cut deeper than any argument could have. She hadn't even asked to see his business plan, his market research, the countless hours of work he'd compiled to prove the viability of his idea. In that moment, something shifted between them, an invisible fault line cracking beneath the surface of their marriage. Grant walked back to his office and closed the door, the sound echoing with a finality he wasn't ready to acknowledge. For the next few weeks, Grant threw himself into his work at the software company, his dream temporarily shelved but not forgotten. He was quieter at home, the rejection still stinging whenever he thought about it. Isla seemed oblivious to the change. Or perhaps she was simply relieved that he'd dropped the subject of the app. What Grant couldn't know, was that Isla harbored a secret that was slowly eating away at her. 3 months earlier, she'd made a decision that would ultimately prove catastrophic for their marriage. IT had started with a phone call from her mother, Frances Lawrence, a woman who had always lived as though her bank account contained an extra zero. Frances had called Isla in tears, explaining that her old car had finally given out and she'd found the perfect replacement, a brand new BMW. The only problem was the financing. "I just need a small loan, darling," Frances had said, her voice honey-sweet over the phone. "Just until my investments mature next year. You know, I'm good for it." Isla had hesitated, knowing her mother's track record with money. "Mom, a BMW? Couldn't you get something more practical? At my age?" Frances had laughed. "Isla, I've worked hard all my life. I deserve a little luxury. Besides, what's the point of having a successful daughter if she can't help her mother out in a time of need?" The guilt trip was textbook Frances Lawrence, and despite knowing better, Isla had caved. But what had started as a small loan had quickly ballooned. The BMW was just the beginning. Soon, Frances needed help with the insurance, then with maintenance costs, then with a weekend trip to celebrate her new car. Isla had taken out a $625,000 loan, using their house as collateral, all without Grant's knowledge or consent. It was a betrayal on a fundamental level, and with each passing day, the weight of her lie grew heavier. Now, as Grant processed his own disappointment, Isla carried her burden silently, making excuses for the extra hours she worked, for the stress that lined her face, for the way she checked their mail before Grant could see it. She told herself it was temporary, that her mother would pay her back soon, that Grant would never need to know. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in a marriage already showing signs of strain. Grant noticed the changes in Isla over the following weeks, the late nights at work, the tense phone calls she took in another room, the way she flinched when their bank statements arrived. At first, he attributed it to stress at her job, maybe even lingering tension from their argument about his app. But as days turned into weeks, the oddities multiplied. One evening, he came home early to surprise her with dinner, only to find Isla at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, her face pale and drawn. When she saw him, she hastily gathered the documents, stuffing them into a folder. "What's that?" Grant asked, setting the takeout bags on the counter. "Nothing," Isla replied too quickly. "Just work stuff." But Grant had caught a glimpse of their bank letterhead. "Work stuff from our bank." Isla's hesitation was brief, but noticeable. "It's nothing, Grant. Just some account maintenance." The lie hung between them, so obvious that Grant couldn't let pass. "Show me." "Grant, show me." Isla. His voice carried an edge he rarely used. Reluctantly, Isla handed over the folder. Grant opened it and began reading, his expression darkening with each line. Loan statements, payment schedules, their house listed as collateral. "What is this?" he asked, though the documents painted a clear picture. $625,000? Against our house. He looked up, disbelief giving way to anger. "When were you going to tell me about this?" Isla stood, wringing her hands. I was handling it. Handling it. Grant's voice rose. This isn't a work project, Isla. This is our life. Our home. He flipped through more papers. And what's this about a BMW? Please tell me this isn't for your mother. Isla's silence was confirmation enough. You're kidding me, Grant said, dropping the papers onto the table. You took out a loan against our house without telling me to buy your mother a luxury car? She needed help, Grant. She's been struggling, Isla said defensively, pacing around the living room. Struggling. Grant laughed bitterly. A BMW isn't a necessity, Isla. It's a status symbol. It's not just about the car, Isla insisted. She needed... Stop. Grant held up a hand. Just stop. You denied me $65,000 for a business with real potential, but you secretly borrowed over $500,000 for your mother's car. Grant stood still, his fists clenching as anger surged through him. You went behind my back, Isla. You put us in debt for a car when I needed you to believe in me. How could you do this? How could you betray me like this? Isla's face crumpled with regret, but she quickly recovered, defensiveness taking over. It's not just a car, Grant. It's family. She needed it. You just don't get it. You're always focused on your dreams, your business, but what about the reality? The mortgage? The bills? Reality? Grant's voice was dangerously quiet now. The reality is that you've put our future at risk. You betray my trust. You've made a decision that affects both of us without even consulting me. I was going to tell you when the time was right, Isla said, tears forming in her eyes. When would that be, Isla? When we lost the house. When your mother decided she wanted a vacation home to go with her BMW? That's not fair. Fair. Grant laughed again, the sound harsh and devoid of humor. You want to talk about fair? Was it fair to shoot down my dream, but bankroll your mother's lifestyle? Was it fair to make that decision unilaterally? Isla had no answer for that. She stood in the center of the living room, tears streaming down her face, but Grant felt no sympathy. The betrayal cut too deep. I can't even look at you right now, he said, grabbing his keys from the hook by the door. Grant, wait. But he was already walking out, slamming the door behind him with enough force to shake the windows. In the car, he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, trying to process the magnitude of Isla's deception, his dream, dismissed as too risky. Her mother's luxury car, worth a loan that could cost them their home. The contradiction was so stark, so painful, that Grant couldn't find words for the betrayal he felt. He drove aimlessly through the Denver streets, the city lights blurring through tears he refused to acknowledge. When he finally returned home hours later, Isla was asleep or pretending to be in their bed. Grant took a pillow and a blanket to the couch, knowing that something fundamental had broken between them, something that might never be repaired. The weeks that followed brought a steady deterioration of everything Grant had once taken for granted. Their home, once a sanctuary, became a battleground of cold silences and clipped conversations. The warmth that had defined their relationship was replaced by a frigid distance that seemed to widen with each passing day. Grant threw himself into his day job, working longer hours to avoid going home. When he did return, he retreated to his office, tinkering with his app in moments stolen between responsibilities. But the spark that had once fueled his innovation was dimming, smothered by the financial reality Isla had created. The first call from a bank came on a Tuesday afternoon. Grant was in a meeting when his phone vibrated with an unknown number. He excused himself and stepped into the hallway. Mr. Walker, a professionally detached voice asked. This is Marjorie Klein from First National Bank. I'm calling about your loan payment, which is now 2 weeks overdue. Grant's stomach dropped. There must be some mistake. What loan are you referring to? The confusion in his voice must have been evident because the woman paused before continuing. The home equity line of credit taken out against your property on Cedar Avenue. The amount is $625,000. Right? Grant said, his jaw tight. That loan. I'll have to get back to you. He hung up and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. It was the first of many such calls. Despite Isla's promises to handle the loan, payments were being missed. Their credit score, once impeccable, began to slide. Tea home that evening. Grant confronted Isla in the kitchen. The bank called today, he said without preamble. We're late on the loan payment. Isla's hands stilled over the vegetables she was chopping. I'll take care of it tomorrow. With what money, Isla? Our savings are dwindling, and this loan is eating us alive. I told you, I'm handling it. She snapped, the knife coming down with more force than necessary. Like you handled getting us into this mess in the first place. Grant couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. Don't start, Grant. Not tonight. When then? When are we going to talk about the fact that your mother is driving around in a car that might cost us our home? Isla set the knife down with deliberate care. My mother is going to help with the payments. She promised. Grant laughed, the sound hollow. And you believe her? The woman who's never met a luxury she didn't charge to someone else's account. Don't talk about her like that, Isla warned, her eyes flashing. Why not? It's the truth. And while we're on the subject of truth, when were you planning to tell her that her little joyride is destroying our marriage? Isla's face paled. Don't be dramatic. We're having a rough patch, that's all. A rough patch, Grant repeated incredulously. Isla, we're heading for financial ruin because you couldn't say no to your mother. That's not a rough patch. That's a catastrophe. Isla turned away, resuming her chopping with mechanical precision. I don't want to discuss this anymore. Of course not, Grant muttered. Why discuss anything when you can just make unilateral decisions behind my back? He walked out of the kitchen, the conversation, like so many others these days, ending in an impasse. The calls from creditors increased. Grant started intercepting them, trying to make arrangements, but the situation was spiraling. Their once comfortable finances were strained to the breaking point, and the tension between them grew proportionally. Meanwhile, Frances Lawrence remained blissfully unaware or willfully ignorant of the havoc her new BMW was wreaking on her daughter's marriage. She continued to call Isla regularly, each conversation inevitably steering toward some new financial need. A designer handbag to match the car, maintenance costs that were just a bit higher than expected, insurance premiums that were simply outrageous. And Isla, trapped by her own choices, continued to acquiesce, unable to admit to her mother or to Grant the depth of the hole she was digging that Grant's app development stalled. Without the necessary funding, he couldn't hire the team he needed, couldn't secure the server space required, couldn't even devote the time necessary to complete the coding. His dream, once so vibrant and achievable, was withering on the vine. Late one night, hunched over his computer as he had been so many nights before, Grant stared at the lines of code that represented months of work. In the quiet darkness, he allowed himself to imagine what might have been if Isla had believed in him, if she had invested in his future rather than her mother's present. The bitterness that had taken root in his heart grew deeper, feeding on disappointment and betrayal. Something was hardening within him, a resolve born of disillusionment. He was losing everything: his dream, his home, his marriage, and the realization brought with it a clarity he hadn't expected. If he was going to salvage anything from this wreckage, he would need to act decisively. And soon. 2 months into the financial nightmare, Grant was awakened by the sound of Isla's phone ringing at 3 a.m. He rolled over, watching through half-closed eyes as she fumbled for the device in the dark. Mom. Isla's voice was thick with sleep. What's wrong? Grant couldn't hear Frances's response, but he saw Isla sit up straight, fully alert now. What do you mean you're selling the car? Isla's tone was a mixture of disbelief and panic. Mom, we took out a loan for that car. We're still paying for it. There was a pause as Frances responded. A house? You want to buy a house now? Isla's voice rose. Mom, that's insane. You can't sell the car. The loan. Another pause. No, you don't understand. We're already behind on payments. If you sell the car, we'll still owe the money, but we'll have nothing to show for it. Grant sat up now, making no pretense of sleep. Isla glanced at him, her face a mask of distress. Mom, I can't talk about this right now. It's the middle of the night and... She stopped listening. No, I'm not putting Grant before you. This isn't about him. It's about financial responsibility. The irony of those words coming from Isla wasn't lost on Grant. He got out of bed and left the room, unable to listen to more of the conversation in the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, the cool marble beneath his palms a stark contrast to the heat of his anger. This was the final straw. Francis was selling the car that had cost them everything. And for what? A new whim, a new status symbol. Isla joined him a few minutes later, her face pale in the dim light from the range hood. "She's selling the BMW," she said unnecessarily. "She found a house she wants to buy in Aspen. Says she needs the money for a down payment." Grant took a slow sip of water, using the moment to compose himself. "And the loan?" "Our loan. The one that's already delinquent." Isla's shoulders slumped. "She says it's our problem, that she never asked for a loan that big in the first place." The glass in Grant's hand shattered, water and shards scattering across the kitchen floor. He barely felt the cut on his palm. The physical pain, nothing compared to the rage that consumed him. "That's it," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I'm done, Isla." "Grant, you're bleeding," Isla said. Reaching for his hand, he pulled away. "Don't touch me. Don't pretend you care now." "Of course I care," Isla protested. "You're my husband." "Am I?" "Because a wife who cared would have supported my dreams instead of destroying them. A wife who cared would have consulted me before putting our home at risk." Isla's eyes filled with tears. "I made a mistake, Grant. A terrible mistake. I see that now." "Now?" Grant laughed bitterly. "Now that your mother has shown her true colors? Now that we're about to lose everything?" "It's too late, Isla." "It's not too late," she insisted, reaching for a towel to press against his bleeding hand. "We can fix this. Together." Grant pulled his hand away again. "I'll give you one last chance to fix this, Isla. Either you get rid of this debt, or I'm walking away." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. "How am I supposed to do that?" Isla asked, her voice small. "The loan is already in default. My credit is ruined. Yours too, probably." "That's not my problem," Grant said coldly. "You created this mess. You fix it." "Grant, please. We took vows. For better or worse, remember? This isn't worse, Isla. This is betrayal. This is you choosing your mother's luxury over our future." Isla sank into a kitchen chair, her face in her hands. "I never meant for things to go this far. I thought I could handle it. I thought Mom would help with the payments." "You thought wrong," Grant said simply. "And now we're both paying the price." He walked away, leaving Isla alone in the kitchen with her regrets and the scattered pieces of broken glass, a fitting metaphor for what remained of their marriage. The loan deadline approached with the inevitability of an incoming tide. Grant watched Isla make desperate calls to banks, to financial advisors, to her mother, all fruitless. Francis remained unmoved, the BMW already sold, the proceeds earmarked for her Aspen down payment. The night before the final payment was due, Grant packed his suitcase. He moved methodically through their bedroom, collecting the essentials: clothes, toiletries, important documents. Isla stood in the doorway, watching with red-rimmed eyes. "You're really leaving?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Grant didn't look up from his packing. "I told you what would happen if you didn't fix this." "I try, Grant. I've done everything I can." "Except the one thing that mattered," Grant countered. "You never stood up to your mother. You never put us first." "That's not fair," Isla protested weakly. Grant finally looked at her, his gaze direct and unflinching. "What's not fair is watching everything we built crumble because you couldn't say no to a woman who's never thought about anyone but herself." "She's my mother, and I was your husband," Grant said, zipping his suitcase closed. "Past tense. I can't do this anymore, Isla. I can't live in this house, knowing it could be taken away at any moment. I can't sleep next to someone who betrayed me so completely." Isla stepped into the room, reaching for him. "Grant, please. We can start over. Get a smaller place. Rebuild." Grant moved away from her touch. "I can't live like this, Isla. I gave everything for us. You destroyed it all with that loan, and you've destroyed us. I'm leaving." "Where will you go?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "To Micah's," Grant answered, referring to his brother. "At least until I figure out my next move." "When will you come back?" The question was so naive, so disconnected from reality, that Grant almost laughed. "I'm not coming back, Isla. There's nothing to come back to." "There's me," she said desperately. "There's us." Grant shouldered his bag and picked up his suitcase. There's no us anymore. I'm done trying to fix something that was broken the moment you chose your mother's desires over our future. He walked past her, down the stairs, and toward the front door. Isla followed, still pleading, still crying, but Grant had gone beyond the reach of her tears. The betrayal had calcified around his heart, forming a protective shell that her words couldn't penetrate. The door. He turned for one last look at the home they had shared, the life they had built. It had all seemed so solid once, so permanent. Now it was as insubstantial as smoke, disappearing before his eyes. "Goodbye, Isla," he said, his voice steadied. He closed the door on her reply, on the sound of her sobs, on the ruins of their marriage. In his car, he sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts, preparing for the conversation he would have with Micah. His brother had always been supportive but cautious, the voice of reason when Grant's enthusiasm ran ahead of practicality. Tonight, he would need that reason, that steadiness. Because despite the resolve that had carried him out the door, Grant knew that the road ahead was uncertain at best. He had lost his home, his wife, and his dream in one devastating sweep. As he drove away from the house, he couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror. Isla stood in the window, a solitary figure backlit by the warm glow of the home they had once shared. But Grant felt no pull to return, no desire to try again. The woman he had married was now a stranger to him, her betrayal a wall between them that could never be scaled. He turned onto the main road, eyes fixed firmly ahead, leaving behind everything he had once held dear. The night stretched before him, dark and uncertain, but for the first time in months, Grant felt a strange sense of freedom. The worst had happened. He had lost it all. Now he had nothing left to lose. Micah's apartment was smaller than the house Grant had shared with Isla, but it offered something that had been missing for months: peace. The spare bedroom became Grant's temporary sanctuary, a place where he could sleep without the weight of imminent financial collapse pressing on his chest. His brother, to his credit, asked few questions in those first days. He provided food, shelter, and the occasional beer, allowing Grant the space to process his new reality. It wasn't until a week after Grant's arrival that Micah finally broached the subject over dinner. "So," Micah said, passing the takeout container of lo mein across the table, "you planning to tell me what happened? Or am I supposed to guess?" Grant twirled noodles around his fork, considering his response. "Isla took out a loan without telling me. A big one. Used the house as collateral." Micah whistled low. "How big are we talking?" $625,000. Micah choked on his beer. "Jesus Christ. For what?" "A BMW. For her mother." The incredulity on Micah's face would have been comical under different circumstances. "You're shitting me." "Wish I was." Micah shook his head, processing. "And you didn't know anything about it?" "Not until the bills started coming in." Grant took a swig of his beer. "By then, it was too late. We were already behind on payments." "Man, I don't even know what to say. That's fucked up." Grant nodded, the familiar anger bubbling up again. "The best part? Her mother sold the car. Wanted to buy a house in Aspen instead." "Wait, she sold the car you're still paying for." "Exactly." Micah let out a string of curses that perfectly encapsulated Grant's feelings on the matter. When he finished, he fixed Grant with a serious look. "So what now? You guys getting divorced?" The word hung in the air, stark and final. Grant hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead, but hearing it spoken aloud clarified something for him. "Yeah," he said finally. "I guess we are." Micah nodded, accepting this as the logical conclusion. "In your app? The one you were working on?" Grant sighed. "Dead in the water. I needed capital to launch it properly. Isla wouldn't support it, and now..." He shrugged. "Now I've got nothing to invest." "You've got your brain," Micah pointed out, "and your skills. That hasn't changed." Grant hadn't considered that perspective. He'd been so focused on what he'd lost that he'd forgotten what he still possessed: his talent, his vision, his determination. "Maybe," he conceded. "No maybe about it." Micah insisted. "Look, what Isla did was unforgivable. No question. But you can't let her take everything from you, including your dream." Grant considered his brother's words, rolling them around in his mind like unfamiliar objects. "I need funding, connections, resources. Start small, Micah suggested. Build incrementally. Rome wasn't coded in a day, or whatever. Despite himself, Grant laughed. That's terrible. Micah grinned. Made you laugh, though. The moment of levity felt strange, but welcome. A reminder that life continued, even after betrayal. That night, for the first time since discovering Islah's deception, Grant opened his laptop and looked at his app code with fresh eyes. The next morning, he withdrew the last of his personal savings, a modest sum, but enough to buy the server space he needed to launch a beta version of his app. It wouldn't be the grand debut he'd envisioned, but it was a start. Weeks turned into months. Grant found a job at a new tech firm, working during the day and coding at night. His app, streamlined and focused, began to take shape in its new, leaner form. Without the pressure of supporting a household, without the tension that had characterized his final months with Islah, his creativity flourished. Micah supported him throughout, offering practical advice and occasional funding when resources ran tight. More importantly, he believed in Grant's vision, providing the validation that Islah had withheld. The divorce proceedings moved forward with clinical efficiency. Grant attended the necessary meetings, signed the required papers, and watched as his marriage was dismantled with the same legal precision with which it had been constructed. The house, now deeply underwater due to the defaulted loan, was foreclosed upon. Islah, he heard through mutual friends, had moved in with her mother, a fitting irony that Grant appreciated but didn't dwell on. 6 months after leaving his home, Grant launched his app. It was a quieter debut than he had once imagined, with no press release, no launch party, no fanfare. Just a simple upload to the app stores and a modest social media announcement. But sometimes, the smallest beginnings lead to the greatest outcomes. The first download came within an hour of the app's launch. By the end of the day, there were 50 users. By the end of the week, 500. The numbers grew steadily, organically, each new user attracting others through word of mouth and social media shares. Grant monitored the growth with cautious optimism, addressing bugs as they arose, implementing user suggestions, refining the interface. His evenings and weekends disappeared into a blur of coding and customer support, but the exhaustion was different from what he had experienced during the collapse of his marriage. This was productive fatigue, the tired satisfaction of creation rather than the draining despair of destruction. 3 months after the launch, an email arrived in Grant's inbox from a tech investment firm he recognized instantly. Horizon Ventures, one of the most prestigious in the industry. They want to meet, Grant told Micah that evening, still stunned by the development. Tomorrow morning. Micah clapped him on the back. See? What did I tell you? Your brain, your skills. That's all you needed. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Horizon's downtown Denver office. Grant arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in the best suit he owned, which wasn't saying much, and clutching a tablet containing his presentation materials. He had prepared meticulously, anticipating every possible question, rehearsing his answers until they flowed naturally. The Horizon team, led by a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Chun, listened attentively as Grant outlined his app's functionality, its unique selling points, its growth trajectory. When he finished, Victoria leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. Impressive work, Mr. Walker, especially considering you developed this with minimal resources and no team support. Grant nodded, accepting the compliment with a small smile. Thank you. It's been a labor of love. Love and talent, Victoria corrected. Your algorithm is elegant, efficient, and the user interface is incredibly intuitive. She glanced at her colleagues, who nodded in agreement. We'd like to make you an offer. Grant's heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral. I'm listening. $40 million for full acquisition of your app and its technology. The number hit Grant like a physical blow. $40 million. More money than he had ever imagined possessing. Enough to buy back his house a dozen times over. Enough to secure his future permanently. I'd retain creative control, he asked, surprised by the steadiness of his voice. Victoria nodded. With a $10 million sign-on bonus if you agree to join Horizon as Chief Innovation Officer for a minimum 3-year contract. $50 million all told. Grant's mind reeled, but externally, he maintained his composure. I'll need to review the contract details, of course. Of course, Victoria agreed, sliding a folder across the table. Take your time. We're eager to work with you, Mr. Walker, but we understand this is a significant decision. Grant left the meeting in a daze, the folder tucked securely under his arm. On the street, he pulled out his phone to call Micah, then paused. This moment, this vindication, deserved more than a hurried sidewalk conversation. That evening, over expensive steaks and equally expensive whiskey, Grant told his brother about the offer. Micah's jubilation was everything Grant could have hoped for. Genuine, enthusiastic, proud. $50 million, Micah repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. My little brother, the millionaire. Grant smiled, the reality still sinking in. Not yet. I haven't signed anything. But you will, Micah said confidently. It's a no-brainer. Grant took a sip of his whiskey, savoring the burn. It's everything I wanted. Everything Isla said wasn't possible. At the mention of his ex-wife, Micah's expression sobered. Have you heard from her? No, Grant replied truthfully. Not since the divorce was finalized. Are you going to tell her about this? Micah asked, watching Grant carefully. Grant considered the question, rolling his whiskey glass between his palms. I think she'll find out eventually. News travels. And when she does, Micah pressed. What then? Grant set his glass down, his decision crystallizing. Then I'm going to show her exactly what she gave up when she chose her mother over me. Micah raised an eyebrow. Revenge, little brother? Doesn't seem like your style. It wasn't, Grant agreed. But I'm not the same man I was a year ago. The truth of that statement resonated deeply. The Grant Walker who had begged for his wife's support, who had been devastated by her betrayal, who had walked away from his home with nothing but a suitcase and shattered dreams, that man was gone. In his place stood someone harder, more determined, less forgiving, someone who was about to become very, very wealthy. Grant signed a contract the next day. The news of the acquisition broke 2 days later, splashed across tech blogs and financial news sites. Horizon Ventures acquires cybersecurity startup for $40 million, the headlines proclaimed. Unknown developer lands major deal. Grant's phone exploded with congratulatory messages from former colleagues, old friends, distant acquaintances. But the one name he was half expecting, half dreading, didn't appear among the notifications. Isla remained silent. Whether she had seen the news and chosen not to reach out, or whether she remained blissfully unaware of her ex-husband's sudden success, Grant couldn't know. And for now, he was content to let the anticipation build, to allow his plan to take shape in the quiet recesses of his mind. Because while success was sweet, vindication would be sweeter still. 3 weeks after signing the deal with Horizon, Grant stood on the sidewalk in front of the house he had once shared with Isla. The foreclosure had been completed months ago, the property now owned by the bank that held the defaulted loan. A for sale sign stood in the front yard, the realtor's smiling face beaming from the corner of the placard. Grant had always liked this house. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was solid, well-built, with character that newer constructions lacked. He and Isla had spent weekends painting the rooms, refinishing the hardwood floors, planting a garden in the backyard. They had created a home together, only for her to gamble it away on her mother's whims. But he pulled out his phone and made a call. Miss Chun, Grant Walker, I'd like to make an investment. The purchase was completed within days, expedited by cash payment and Horizon's considerable influence. The bank, eager to offload the property, accepted Grant's offer without haggling. By the end of the week, Grant held the keys to his former home once again, but this time solely in his name, that he didn't move back in immediately. First, he hired contractors to renovate the space, erasing all traces of his life with Isla. New paint, new fixtures, new furniture. The master bedroom was transformed into a home office, the spare room converted to a guest suite. The garden Isla had tended so carefully was replaced with low-maintenance landscaping. When the work was complete, Grant stood in the center of the living room, taking in the transformation. The house was the same, yet entirely different. Like him. Now it was time for the final act. Finding Isla wasn't difficult. She had indeed moved in with Francis, whose Aspen dreams had apparently been deferred. They were living in Francis's old condo, a luxurious but outdated space in a once fashionable part of Denver. Grant hired a car and driver for the day, instructing the man to wait outside while he conducted his business. Standing at Francis's door, Grant straightened his custom-tailored suit jacket and pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed inside, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. The door swung open, and there stood Isla, her expression freezing in shock as she recognized her visitor. "Grant?" she said, her voice barely audible that he smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Hello, Isla. May I come in?" She stepped back automatically, allowing him entry. The condo was cluttered with Francis's belongings, the space cramped compared to the home they had shared. Isla looked different than he remembered, thinner, with dark circles under her eyes that even carefully applied makeup couldn't completely conceal. "I saw the news," she said, gesturing vaguely. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Grant replied coolly. "Is your mother home?" Isla shook her head. "She's at her yoga class. Won't be back for an hour." "Good. What I have to say is for you alone." Isla motioned toward the living room, and they sat on opposite ends of a floral-patterned sofa that had seen better days. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken recriminations and regrets. "You look well," Isla offered finally. "Success agrees with me," Grant replied. "How's your mother enjoying her new BMW? Oh, wait, she sold it, didn't she? For a house that never materialized." Isla flinched at the barb. "Grant, I know I made a terrible mistake. I've had a lot of time to think about everything, and I didn't come here for apologies," Grant interrupted, "or explanations. It's too late for either." "Then why did you come?" Isla asked, confusion evident in her expression. Grant reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a set of keys, placing them on the coffee table between them. "These are for you." Isla stared at the keys, then back at Grant. "I don't understand." "They're house keys," Grant explained, "to our old house on Cedar Avenue." Hope bloomed across Isla's face, a transformation that Grant observed with detached interest. "You bought it back?" "For us." "I bought it back," Grant confirmed. "But there is no us, Isla. There hasn't been since the day you chose your mother's luxury over our future." The hope in Isla's eyes dimmed. "Then why are you giving me these keys?" "I'm not," Grant said simply. "I'm showing them to you. I want you to know that the house you lost, the life you threw away, is mine again. But you have no place in it." Isla's face paled. "You bought our house back just to tell me I can't live in it? That's cruel, Grant." "Cruel?" Grant laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Cruel was taking out a loan behind my back. Cruel was putting our home at risk for a car. Cruel was dismissing my dreams while bankrolling your mother's extravagance." He picked up the keys, returning them to his pocket. "You wanted me to sell this house for your mother's debts," he said, his voice steady. "But it's not just your house anymore." Tears welled in Isla's eyes. "What do you want from me, Grant? An apology?" "I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I see that now. I've lost everything: my home, my husband, my credit, my future." Grant stood, unmoved by her tears. "You broke me, Isla," he said, his voice unwavering. "But I'm not the same man anymore. You gambled with everything we had. Now you have nothing, and that makes you happy?" Isla asked, tears streaming down her face. "See me like this?" Grant considered the question, surprised to find that the answer wasn't as straightforward as he had anticipated. The vindication he had expected, the satisfaction of showing Isla exactly what she had lost, it was there, but muted, tempered by the realization that revenge, while sweet, was also hollow. "No," he answered truthfully. "It doesn't make me happy, but it does make us even." He walked to the door, Isla following a few steps behind. "Goodbye, Isla," he said, his hand on the doorknob. "I hope your mother was worth it." Outside, the driver opened the car door as Grant approached. Before getting in, Grant paused, looking back at the condo building. Isla stood in the doorway, a solitary figure framed by the entrance to her mother's home, a woman who had sacrificed her future for someone who would never appreciate the cost. For a brief moment, Grant felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of betrayal, of dreams denied, of trust irreparably broken that he got into the car. "Home," he instructed the driver, and as they pulled away from the curb, Grant didn't look back. The Denver skyline glowed in the golden light of sunset as Grant stood on the balcony of his penthouse office at Horizon Ventures. 6 months had passed since his confrontation with Isla, 6 months of immersing himself in his new role, his new life, his new identity. Chief Innovation Officer suited him. The position challenged his intellect, rewarded his creativity, and provided the validation that had once seemed so elusive. His days were filled with meetings, pitches, development sessions. His name was becoming synonymous with cutting-edge technology in the industry. "Grant, do you have a minute?" He turned to find Victoria Chun standing in the doorway, tablet in hand. "Always," he replied, gesturing for her to join him. Victoria crossed to the balcony, her movements as precise and efficient as her business decisions. "The quarterly numbers are in," she said, handing him the tablet. "Your division has exceeded projections by 37%. Grant scanned the report, noting the upward trend across all metrics. "The team deserves the credit," he said. "They've been exceptional." "The team follows your lead," Victoria countered. "Don't undersell yourself, Grant. What you've accomplished here in 6 months would take most people years." He smiled, accepting the compliment with a nod. "Thank you." Victoria leaned against the balcony railing, studying him with her characteristic directness. "The board is impressed. There's talk of expanding your division, giving you more resources, a bigger team." "I'd welcome that," Grant said honestly. "Good." Victoria paused, her gaze shifting to the city skyline. "On a personal note, how are you settling in? Denver treating you well?" Grant considered the question. He had moved out of Micah's apartment months ago, into a sleek downtown condominium that better suited his new position. The house on Cedar Avenue remained his property, but he rarely visited. It served as a reminder rather than a home, a monument to what had been lost and regained. "Denver's always been home," he replied, "just seeing it from a different perspective now." Victoria nodded, understanding the layers in his response. "And the other perspective shift? The one that comes with sudden wealth and success? How's that treating you?" Grant chuckled, still adjusting. "My brother says I need to loosen up, enjoy it more." "Wise man, your brother," Victoria said with a smile. "Success without enjoyment is just another form of failure." The observation struck Grant as unexpectedly profound. He had achieved everything he had once dreamed of: financial security, professional recognition, vindication, but had he allowed himself to enjoy any of it? "Something to think about," he acknowledged. Victoria straightened, resuming her professional demeanor. "The executive dinner is at 7. Don't be late. The board chairman specifically asked that you sit at his table." "I'll be there," Grant promised. After Victoria left, Grant remained on the balcony, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The city below was transforming, day yielding to night, lights beginning to twinkle against the darkening canvas. His phone vibrated with a text from Micah. "Dinner tomorrow?" "Got big news." Grant smiled, typing a quick response. "Your place or mine?" Micah's reply came immediately. "Yours." "Mine doesn't have a chef." Grant laughed out loud. His brother's humor, his unwavering support, his refusal to be impressed by Grant's newfound wealth, these were constants in a life that had otherwise changed completely. As darkness settled over Denver, Grant thought about Victoria's words. Success without enjoyment was indeed another form of failure. He had spent the past year focused on survival, then revenge, then proving himself in his new role. Perhaps it was time to redefine success, to measure it not by bank accounts or professional accolades, but by simpler metrics: laughter with his brother, satisfaction in creation, peace within himself. The confrontation with Isla had provided closure, but not necessarily healing. The revenge he had sought had been achieved, but the victory felt less significant than he had anticipated. What mattered now was not the past he had avenged, but the future he would build. Grant took one last look at the city spread out before him, at the life he had created from the ashes of betrayal. He had lost everything, only to gain more than he had ever imagined. The journey had been painful, the lessons hard-won, but standing here now, he wouldn't change a moment of it, because sometimes shattered dreams made way for better ones. From his vantage point high above the city, Grant Walker looked forward, his expression resolute, his vision clear. Behind him lay the ruins of a marriage, the sting of betrayal, the taste of revenge. Before him stretched a future limited only by his imagination, his talent, his newfound confidence. And as the last light of day faded from the sky, Grant turned away from the view, away from the past, and stepped back in his office, back into the life he had built for himself. Brick by painful brick, from the ground up, that IT was, he realized, only the beginning.